So before we go, and the last concept I want to explain today before we finish today's class is probably the most important cost of them all, which is the marginal cost. And the marginal cost is similar to other concepts we have discussed in this class, and that is essential to economics, which is this idea of the how much things change at the margin. And what I mean at the margin is for every extra unit. When we were discussing the marginal product was how much does production increase when I increase 1 unit of my inputs at the margin. And when I decide to hire one more worker or buy one more machine or whatever it is. In the case of the cost, the marginal cost, it's how much does my total cost increase when I decide to hire one more worker, when I decide to buy one more machine, when I decide to increase one input. And that's essentially the idea behind the marginal cost. What is the increase in my total costs as I decide to increase 1 unit any of my inputs? Disregarding what input it is, the moment I decide to hire one more worker or expand a little bit one of those inputs, 1 unit, how much extra cost do I incur as a firm from taking that decision? And the marginal cost is essentially the firm's supply curve. As in the beginning of the course, when we were discussing demand and supply, and we saw that like increasing slope line, that was the supply, this is literally the marginal costs. And the marginal costs are just the representation of the supply curve from the moment you start to produce onwards, from your shutdown point onwards. The supply curve that you show to the market is literally dependent on your marginal cost, and they have the same shape. And that's why we normally use interchangeably in microeconomics the idea of marginal cost of a firm with regards to supply curve. The marginal cost of a firm is the difference from every unit of production. So look at this table that we're seeing in the slide. So you have the level of output on the first column, which is you're basically producing 0 units or producing 5 units, like in that range. And for every unit, you have a total cost. This was the same table from the beginning of today's class, in which I was referring to the different costs. And you had like 55 costs just comprised of the fixed cost. And as you start producing, your total cost increases. That difference between every unit of production is your marginal cost. How much extra cost I have to incur and pay as I decided to increase output 1 unit. So in this case, if I decide to produce the first unit, the increase in my cost is 30%. It's not 30%, 30 pesos or dollars, whatever the unit is. For the second one, it's 25. For the third one is 20. What is the marginal cost for the fourth one? What can you tell me about the marginal cost there?
Vuelvo a subir, ¿no? Es 30.
Exactly. It increases to 30. Yes, correct. And then to 50. And obviously, this continues as your total cost continues to increase. And this is really important because, as you can see, the marginal cost first decreased and then increased. And they have different shapes depending on the particular firm you are and the particular industry you are. And that's a type of thing that the managers need to be really careful about. Because it doesn't matter if you are producing a lot of units, like let's say 20 units in this example. If your total cost is really high and your marginal cost is really high, that means that every unit is really, the cost is really high. You want a smaller cost because, as we will see in a couple of classes, where you have, depending on your marginal costs and what amount of money you're paying for every unit, you will be able to price your product when you send it to the stores. If you have a very high marginal cost, which means you have a very high cost to produce this particular 27,000 unit, because you're producing 27,000 cars or whatever things you're producing, I need to take into account a specific price that covers this cost, because if not, I'm losing money on this unit. And that's why you're at the minimum point at which you can produce without losing money is a point at which the price that you have on the market that you can place in your stores, or that you have to take into account because of the different competing brands, is a price that at least covers your current marginal cost. In what we call perfect competition, we will see after we finish the production side of things a little bit after the midterm. In competitive markets, firms tend to place prices for their products that essentially are really close to their marginal cost. The more competitive the market is and the more brands with which you have to compete, the closer the price that you place for your product will be to the marginal cost. The less competitors you have, the more profit margin you can have. So this is really important to take into account, because this is the crucial cost that you need to take into account the moment you want to place the price of something. As you can see in this particular graph, you have two costs, or the relationship between two costs. The total costs that keep increasing as you keep producing more and more output units, and the marginal cost, which, as you can see, decreases and then increases in a similar fashion as the average variable cost. And you need to take into account that this happens because of the same explanation as before with the average variable cost, because the marginal cost is directly related to the total cost. Actually, the marginal cost is, as it implies in its name, the cost in the margin of the total cost. And this implies that this is the partial derivative of the total cost function. The way you calculate this, and I think this is the next slide. Yes. The way you calculate the marginal cost of a firm is by basically taking the first order derivative of the total cost function. Whatever that total cost function was, you literally take the derivative of that and you find the marginal cost function. And you can do the method in which you can basically subtract one output to the other, like in the previous table that I showed in a couple of slides ago. Or you can just, if you have the actual total cost function, like the equation, you can basically take the partial derivative of it. But as you can see, this is directly related to the variable cost, and that's why the explanation was the same. We had seen a table like this last class that only included the three first costs, the fixed cost, the variable cost, and the total cost. But now, as you can see, this one includes the marginal cost and the three average costs that we went over last class. So the idea is that you see how these different costs are related and at the same time change. And I talk about this because there is, if I can recall correctly, a problem just like this in your problem set, in the sense that you have a cost structure table and you need to fill it out from like just a couple of tidbits of information. And essentially, it's really easy. As long as you have the quantities and you have at least one of the initial costs, whether it is the fixed cost or the variable cost, you can basically fill out the entire table. And but it's a helpful exercise to understand how different costs increase and how they move or how they change, and see the type of patterns or trends that the average costs have, while the different patterns or trends that, for example, the marginal cost have. And I believe that the next slide, this is actually a slide to recap for the purpose of last class, and for this course, we will focus essentially on these 7 costs. The like aggregated ones, which are the total cost, the fixed cost, and the variable cost. The average group ones, which is or are basically just the average of the ones from the first group, and the marginal cost, which we described just recently, and that essentially shows the supply curve of the specific firm, and we will discuss this a little bit later on in today's class. So taking that into account, I normally do this exercise in class in the sense that I give you a table in which, or this table that includes the output or the quantities, the Y row, then a fixed cost for this particular firm or imaginary firm or example, and their variable cost. And I ask people to come up to the board, and like one person has to calculate the total cost, one has to calculate the average cost, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit strange because you already have the presentation like online, and you can download it and stuff like that. So I will just show you how the next slide looks, and based on that, that we basically just talk about how we can get all of these. So this is very similar to the problem in the problem set, in which you have a couple of information and you need to fill out the table. In this case, you have the total amount of units that this firm produces, Y, their fixed costs, and their variable costs. So immediately, by just combining the fixed cost and the variable cost, you can calculate the total cost, C, the fourth row. And that's literally just the sum of both fixed and variable. So you use 5 plus 0, 5 plus 4, 5 plus 7, 5 plus 9, so on and so forth. Pretty self-explanatory how you get the total cost. Then, once you have fixed cost, variable cost, and total cost, you can get the three next rows, the average cost group, just by basically grabbing the correct row. For example, the average total cost implies that you grab the total cost row and basically divide by the number of units being produced. So in the third column, our total cost would be, in the fourth column, I mean, our total cost would be 5 plus 7, that's 12. And therefore, the average cost implies grabbing that 12 that we just found out and divided by the number of units being produced, in this case, 2. Therefore, our average total cost would be 6. And just like that, you can get all of the other average costs. The key thing is to get the correct, basically the correct row. The average fixed cost work with basically you work with a fixed cost. The average variable, you work with a variable cost, and like that. And the marginal cost, you can find it in various ways. One way, and that's a little bit what we showed in the last like tables and like graphs or images from last class, is that the marginal cost is the difference between every additional unit. So you can basically take the difference of the total cost from the column with one quantity of output versus the column where the total output is 0, and like 2 with 1, and 3 with 2, and 4 with 5, 3 with 4, sorry, 5 and 4, 6 and 5, stuff like that. And that's one way you can do it, basically by subtracting what you find the total cost from one column to the next. Or you can also do the same thing with the variable cost. You will find the same result basically by working with variable costs. So you can subtract either the total costs and from column to column, and that is basically the marginal cost, or you can subtract the variable cost and also you will find the same result. Therefore, when we actually take into account how this looks, this is essentially how the table gets completed. So as we discussed, you add up the total cost from the fixed cost and the variable cost. You can divide by 0, basically, so there's nothing in the first column with regards to the average cost. And also there's no additional extra unit costs, which is the marginal cost, when you have not started to produce, basically. So that's why it's also a blank, that the rest of that column. And the other ones are essentially just how we described. You take the average for the average costs, and you take the difference from column 1 to column 2, and like that, to get the marginal cost. So for example, the first marginal cost we see, the one that reads 4, in the third column in the last row, That's just the difference between the subtraction of the total cost from that column with the column immediately before. So 9 minus 5 equals 4. But it's also the same number if we subtract the variable cost from the same columns. 4 minus 0 equals 0, and like that. Questions regarding how you would complete this table in a regular exercise?